I think one of the things that I want really for my agency and for our country as a whole is to remember that we're not about who the person is sitting in a chair. We're about the rule of law. We have to remember that this is about getting the institutions right so that we can protect people's, we can protect people, but protecting people includes protecting their freedom.
SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce, thank you so much for coming back on Coinage.
Zach, it's great to be here. You know, I have to start with my disclaimer, of course, which is that my views are my own views as a commissioner, not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners.
Yes, of course. And I always start with my own disclaimer as well, which is I'm just speaking for Coinage here as the host. But I'm so glad to have you back on because we chatted last time before the court appeal even came out, that decision, the 3-0 unanimous decision here in the Grayscale case. You were pretty adamant about the way that the SEC was handling Bitcoin ETFs and the delay in approving them. Now that it's happened, now that they're trading, what has this changed about the way that the SEC might police crypto?
I don't think this changes a lot. I think it's really important for people to remember that this is about a securities product that trades on securities exchanges. It's not about what the underlying is. We don't police the gold markets, but we have securities products that are built on gold. So it's really important for people to bear that in mind. I think it was really a function of the fact that the court nudged us quite directly to move forward, and so we did. I don't know that people should read much more into it than that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that too, because you put out a statement that, is a little bit different than the statement we saw from Chair Gensler around the approval. And one of those pieces weighed in on why we got here and the commission's thinking around why we got here. And one of those things was specifically looking at Bitcoin futures and the way they're traded. And you said not much has changed in that regard since you already looked at that for over 2 years. So what did you make of kind of the way that the SEC presented this approval?
Well, I think that, we were in a place where we were going to have to move forward. And part of what made it so difficult to move forward, even with a court ruling, is that the rationale for denying these products in the past was very hard to put one's finger on. It was something that I had struggled with, and it seemed like the goalposts were moving over time as people came in with new data. The SEC seemed to want more. And so I think we saw that in how the ultimate analysis was done. But the staff of the commission has, they're obviously looking carefully at these markets, and we did have a correlation analysis, and I don't think anyone would deny that those markets, the futures markets and the spot markets, are correlated.
Yeah, I think that that's kind of the interesting thing now as we look ahead to Ethereum applications and the idea of an ETH ETF and that deadline, I think, coming up in late May, is there are, of course, futures trading for Ethereum too. So, I mean, when you look at maybe the SEC's changed thinking around what is or is not a security beyond Bitcoin, how does that maybe tie into whether or not an approval would happen on the ETH ETF front?
Well, again, I think it's important to remember that you don't even have to look through to the question of whether or not the underlying is a security. That really isn't the issue in these Bitcoin exchange or these more generally exchange traded product approvals. You can have lots of things underlying an exchange traded product, but I do think that, to your point, that the reasoning that's used and the rationale that's used in the Bitcoin exchange traded product approvals is going to be precedent for when people come in, as some have already, and asked for other kinds of approvals of similar kinds of products for other assets.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Obviously, there's a bunch of different ETFs. It could be a commodity, it could be whatever. But I guess that's the hardest thing to square is, if it was only the case that Bitcoin ETFs got approved because of a court ruling specifically about Bitcoin ETF applicants, does that mean that, in your reading, that's going to have to happen to have an ETH ETF approved?
Another court case?
Yes, and an appeal and the whole process and, the battle.
That's not how we're going to do our approvals. As I've said through this process, what we need to be doing is we need to just be applying regular way consideration to these products, the same kind of consideration that we apply to similar products. And so we shouldn't need a court to tell us that our approach is arbitrary and capricious in order for us to get it right. So I certainly hope that won't be the case. People will look to precedent in making arguments for other products, and we, looking at the facts and circumstances, will presumably apply that precedent.
Yeah, let's unpack that a little bit more, because I liked this from your statement on the approval. You said perhaps the one silver lining here is, now that we know that the Commission can execute a robust correlation analysis, perhaps the road to approving other spot crypto ETPs will not be as bumpy. Even if the Commission insists on continuing to apply a test, it applies nowhere else. And as we discussed last time, the nowhere else is the fact that you thought for years the SEC was being unfair in looking at Bitcoin ETFs versus other products. And, in that sense, as I said, for May, people have been going back and forth. There's odds around an ETH ETF about 50%. I'm not asking you to present odds and whether or not that's too high or too low. But given the way this has gone, is it fair to say that maybe Gary Gensler's role in steering all of this has changed relative to where it was before?
Look, I think that Chair Gensler saw the court's analysis and reacted accordingly, and I think that that's kind of where we are. And the agency, having heard from a court that the approach we were taking was wrong, really wrong in the sense of not showing the kind of consistency that a regulator needs to show. I think that kind of a lesson will certainly stick with us. I don't want to predict what will happen with any particular exchange traded product. The facts and circumstances do matter. And as we saw, I think even with the Bitcoin exchange traded products, there's a lot of work that goes into getting an exchange traded product ready for market, including making sure that the disclosures are lining up with how the product actually works. And so these things can take a long time and can be difficult, and really do depend on the facts and circumstances of each product.
Well, yeah, again, you quoted Macbeth in your statement with the old "out damn spot, out I say," which I enjoy. I think we should just appreciate that for what it is, because it's rare to see a Shakespeare citation up there on an SEC statement. But in that sense, right, what does this mean for you? Because you've been calling for this for so long. You also said, we've wasted years as the commissioner has kind of delayed this. I mean, what does it mean to see it finally approved? Basically saying, look, Hester Peirce was right on this one for a while.
Well, it's not about me saying I was right. I do think that title reflected my frustration, which is, how many times do we have to go through this process before we just do our job and get these products out? Because I thought that they had met the requirements for being out much earlier. And so in that sense, it's relief that we finally moved forward with that. Again, I know Chair Gensler made a statement that we're not suggesting that we're approving any particular product. This is not an endorsement of any particular product, the exchange traded product itself or the underlying Bitcoin. But it is a good thing to let the American people decide whether they want to hold these products in their portfolios or not. And so, as I said in the statement, I do celebrate the fact that people can now make their own decision. They can choose to invest in one of these products, or they can choose not to. But we're not holding back from the market a cost-effective way of getting access and an efficient way of getting access to Bitcoin for people who choose to do it. And again, this is not. There were other ways for people to get access to Bitcoin. You can always buy it directly, but if you want to access it as an investor in the securities markets, there were other options for people to get access. But a lot of people argue that this is a more efficient way to do so, and so let's let the market make that call.
Yeah, I think back to our last conversation that happened last summer around this and how powerful it was to hear your thoughts on liberty and just giving people choice. Again, not saying that they should or should do anything around buying anything, but at least the option was important in the service of liberty. I thought that was pretty powerful. I also wonder if the idea of a 3-2 vote, a lot of people focused on the idea of that vote and what it could signal here. Do you think too much was getting applied to that, just kind of given that the court ruling had happened and it seemed like Chair Gensler already knew the way that his thinking had changed? I mean, should we not read too much into the 3-2 vote and kind of where the SEC's at now?
Well, I think what you should read is Commissioner Crenshaw's dissent, because it outlines her reasons for not supporting it, and I think it does provide a little bit of a window into, certainly a direct window into her thinking, but I think more broadly into some of the concerns that are out there around crypto. But Zach, I'm glad you brought up the liberty point, because I think that that's something that too often in our hyper regulated world, we forget about what the other side of regulation is, which is when you come in to regulate to protect someone, you're taking away people's choices. We may as a society conclude that in some instances that's a good thing to do, but we always have to be candid about what we're doing, which is we are telling adult Americans you cannot do something that they would otherwise want to do. And so I think we have to be mindful of that. The whole point of having a commission is to have different points of view reflected in rulemaking, and I think you saw that play out with the exchange traded products. But I think one important viewpoint to have reflected is that this is a country based on the ability of people to make choices for themselves.
Yeah, and I also feel like, again, it's reflective of you can have disagreements. And certainly if anyone's been watching what you've been saying at the SEC, there's certainly been disagreements around, the way that crypto should be regulated and the idea specifically of Bitcoin ETF applications and approvals, certainly differences of opinions there. There were other, I guess, dramatics, even beyond the vote and approval. There was also the hacking that happened at the SEC and involving the Twitter account, the X account. Obviously, there are details there, but I'm just curious about how all of that shaped up in terms of what you saw, because you're already dealing with differences of opinion. You're already dealing with, I guess, your take and other commissioners' take. And then you layer on top of it just kind of confusion and everything else. I think you called it kind of the circus-like atmosphere because of all this attention on the deadline and delaying that led to this. I mean, can you kind of just take us inside the room of kind of what that scene was like after so many months of differences of opinion?
I mean, I think the scene is. I think circus is the right description of what had happened. And this really, I mean, first of all, with respect to the X hack, that's something that we're working with law enforcement to figure out how that happened and deal with that appropriately. But I think that the broader point that you raise is that we wouldn't have been in this place of where someone would even think to do something like that, or where it would be worth the time of someone to do something like that, if we hadn't built up so much attention on these approvals. And that we could have avoided by just using our regular way approach of dealing with exchange traded product applications. And so I do think that that's quite problematic for us to be part of building so much anticipation around one regulatory decision deadline. Sometimes that happens, but I think in this instance, we really created that problem.
Yeah, I guess that would be, the second question around the May deadline for the ETH ETFs. And again, a general rule, I think, is always good to learn from prior experiences. And maybe that would be another check in the Hester Peirce column to say, hey, she was right on that last one. Maybe we shouldn't wait for this deadline in late May. So, I mean, I wonder if that also maybe is tied into what the SEC experienced and whether or not that, again, kind of makes them think differently around the ETH ETF application pipeline.
Yeah, I mean, I think with respect to each of these things, we'll think about them, their deadlines built into the statutory framework, that into our regulatory framework. We have deadlines, and that's kind of the nature of the beast. But you're right that we don't have to. We should be thinking of what happened before, and we should strive to avoid having a similar kind of attention. But I think we're there already in the sense that this has been a years long build up to when Bitcoin exchange traded product, and then people are going to ask the same question about other kinds of exchange traded products.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very hard to reel that back once you've gotten into that mode of focusing so much on it.
And maybe I'll ask a better question too, though, because it sounds like it's not even a question of whether it's a security or not, though we haven't necessarily heard a clear answer one way or the other. But what is the biggest difference you think that the Commission's looking at between the two, a Bitcoin ETF application and approval versus an ETH approval?
Again, I think we have to look at every application on its facts and circumstances, and because we're considering an ETH product application, it's really, I can't really discuss it now. It's under our consideration at this point.
Fair enough. Yes, without getting into the specifics of the individual applications themselves, I just wonder if there's a bigger level piece of it that might be different, just given the learnings from the Bitcoin ETF applications.
I mean, I hope that we will learn from everything that we did before. I hope we'll learn from the precious metal applications that we've done in the past. I hope that we'll learn from how other jurisdictions have fared with similar kinds of products. There are lots of things that we can draw on, and I hope that we draw on more than just our as an agency, general skepticism of anything that touches on crypto, which seems to be how we've approached a lot of these problems in the past.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess that's the big thing is, right, and without getting into any specifics of any cases, because I know you can't comment on ongoing cases, but it has been interesting to kind of see if the SEC wants to take the approach of, look, we're not going to rule one way or the other or, give any specifics necessarily about anything beyond Bitcoin. The questions of what is and what is not a security have come up in, judicial rulings and judges' rulings. And right now, of course, the SEC is in a case against Coinbase. At the heart of that is what is really a crypto security? What does that look like? And again, without getting into those cases specifically, I wonder if there's been any sort of evolution in the way that some of these bigger questions have been tackled since you've been at the Commission, in kind of looking at now secondary trading and whether or not the Howey test even applies to that. I do feel the optimistic side of me wants to say we've come a long way since you and I have known each other in how the SEC looks at some of these things. But at the same time, I don't know. So I wonder if any of this is getting any clearer from where you sit.
I mean, I tend to think that what we've done so far is we've used regulation to answer questions that we should have been asking and answering in public conversations with people who, so that everyone could be part of these conversations, and frankly, recognizing that Congress may well have something to say on whether Congress wants a specific regulatory framework for crypto assets and what that would look like. And we've seen several examples actually of proposals being put forward in Congress to deal with those issues. So I continue to be concerned that our approach at answering some of these questions is primarily being carried out through enforcement actions.
Well, I guess, yeah, enforcement actions and now, too, judge rulings and cases being brought against crypto players as the SEC does that as well in the battles playing out. And I wonder if there's any piece of that maybe has you thinking differently about the way that some of this is being policed, specifically, again, like the Howey test applications to crypto. Seems like it's shifted from issuers themselves, maybe, to now the exchanges, and whether secondary trading should be tied to those tests. I don't know if that's kind of new in the way that you've thought about things.
No, I mean, I think these are questions that we have needed to think all along, because the Howey test is has gotten a lot of attention in the crypto world, of course. But I think the biggest point I've been trying to make all along is let us have some clear thinking around how we're going to apply this in this space, and have some consideration about how if we applied the test the same way in other areas, what that would look like. And that may help us to then make sure that we're applying the test appropriately. But again, I'm not really the one to talk about this because I have taken a different approach to this than my colleagues. I did a number of years ago put out a safe harbor, which was designed at getting disclosures to people buying these tokens. And I think that was trying to solve the problem that we as an agency worry about, which is that people buying these tokens are not getting disclosures about the teams behind them, what the the token economics, and so forth. There are ways to solve that problem, but if you want it to really be an effective approach, one-off enforcement actions are less effective than having an approach that allows us all really to sit down together and say, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What makes sense here? Are we really trying to force people into a model that looks just like, that forces each of these token projects basically to go through an IPO-like process? That doesn't make sense. So what are we trying to accomplish here? And that's really been my frustration, is that we're not really advancing things
Mm-hmm.
in the using the approach that we've used it. What are we trying to get at the end of the day? I think that's what we need to really all sit down and think about, and then think about what the best way to get there is.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I'm glad you brought that up. And I remember talking with you on Yahoo Finance actually about the safe harbor kind of plan that you put out. And again, Congress is, I think, applying a lot of what you've put out to what they're working on in various bills. But I do think that that is a fact that we probably, and everyone in this space can probably agree on, is that crypto and regulating crypto seems to have gotten extremely politicized. To your point, it's no longer really about, hey, how can we create a best solution, but now kind of square peg, round hole, you're either on one side or you're not. And what does that mean to you as a regulator who's just trying to protect consumers? And I do believe you have that as your driving principle. I don't know if I can say that necessarily about other commissioners or the way that it's been handled thus far. I mean, why do you think it's become so politicized, and how should be the right path forward for the U.S. to fix that?
Well, I can say with certainty that my colleagues are thinking about how best to protect investors. That is part of our mission. We have a mission that also includes facilitating capital formation and fostering market integrity. And those are the things that are driving my colleagues as they think about these issues, and certainly driving me as well. It is unfortunate to see issues like this really being taken and viewed through maybe a political lens, or through just um, a lens that doesn't really think pragmatically about what we're trying to achieve. And so that's kind of where I'm trying to shift it. But I think you see in Congress there are bipartisan efforts to develop these frameworks. So I think if we really were to seriously all sit down together, we could do this. This being, develop a regulatory framework that balances those liberty interests that I care so much about, but also balances the need to make sure that there's information out there for people to make good choices. We could do this. We've wasted a ton of time doing other things, and I would like us to stop and change course.
I think there's a lot of people within the industry, myself included, who would hear you say that and say, please, good Lord, let Hester Peirce handle more of this stuff. Please put her in a position of power to make some of this stuff happen and really lean into that. And I'd be remiss, again, if I didn't ask kind of what Hester Peirce wants to do in all this. And I feel like I was looking back on all of our conversations. I'm not sure I've ever asked you if you would want to be chair. Of course, this is an election year, and who knows what's going to happen in kind of that playing out. But a lot of people are talking about whether or not it should be Chair Peirce. What would you say to that, and the idea of kind of stepping up into that role if a Republican does win? Obviously, Chair Gensler's term is through 2026. But what do you want?
I think one of the things that I want really for my agency and for our country as a whole is to remember that we're not about who the person is sitting in a chair. We're about the rule of law, and that's really what I'm arguing for. I think there are so many capable people in this country, and what we need to do is build institutional frameworks that work well who's sitting in a particular seat. And so that's what I most passionately care about, and that's what I will continue to argue for, not only with respect to crypto, but with respect to other things that we and other government regulators do. We have to remember that this is about getting the institutions right so that we can protect people's. We can protect people, but protecting people includes protecting their freedom.
Yeah, well, you've been pretty selfless in that endeavor. As I said, again, it's super powerful to hear your thoughts and to see your statements, especially. I think last time we asked is what people who have appreciated that from you, what they could do to support and help. And I think, again, your statement was just continue, I guess, writing and telling congressmen and women that this matters. But I mean, if you were tapped, would you accept, would you want to lean into that to be chair of the SEC?
I don't even think that that's something that matters, right? Again, it does not matter who sits in the seat. It matters if that the institution stick to its knitting and do its job. And that's what we've got to enforce. I mean, I'll also point you to my colleague, Commissioner Ueda. He also put out a statement, which I think I commend that to people's reading as well. He's someone I've really enjoyed working with on these issues because he does take a much more precise, and I think you'll see that in the statement. He takes a much more precise approach to thinking through these legal issues, and that is the kind of approach that is really valuable.
The last time, and last question here, because I know you got to go, but around some of the politicized nature of the way that the SEC, and I think not the SEC, but the way that it's perceived, some of this has gone. I wonder if this being an election year, if a Republican president were to come into office, if there were any changes you'd think to the way that crypto has been regulated in the U.S. Obviously, we're waiting to see what Congress is going to do in all this, but if there's any sort of kind of deviation from the status quo over the last few years, that might bring when you look through the SEC's lens?
I mean, I would hope that that a new administration would bring a new way of thinking about lots of issues, including crypto. But no one has to wait for there to be a new administration for us to change course on how we deal with crypto. That is something that we could do immediately, and I would recommend that we not wait for elections.
Is there anything, by the way, around, we've seen a lot more candidates talking about a central bank digital currency, and more of them saying they want nothing to do with it and would block it if it ever came to fruition. I'm curious how that maybe impacts any sort of piece of the way the SEC looks at digital currencies and crypto and the like.
Yeah, I mean, CBDCs are really outside of our purview. I think that as a market regulator, I enjoy seeing private competition among different private offerings, and that's what you can have with a stablecoin marketplace. CBDC is just one for the nation, and so from my vantage point, I'm always interested to see competition, and that competition can include ensuring that there are really strong privacy protections built into stablecoins.
Well, I just want to thank you for coming back on, first of all, because I know you can go anywhere and chat with anybody, and you came back on Coinage, and so I really appreciate your time. But more importantly, I think, speaking for the entire community, and again, both sides of this, just people who want to see consumers protected, because that honestly is something that hasn't happened in this space for a while. I just want to thank you personally for everything you've done on driving that forward, because it's still something clearly that the United States needs to get right. But Hester Peirce, thank you so much for coming back on and chatting with us today.
Zach, it's always great to chat with you. Thanks a lot.
All right, we'll see you again soon. Commissioner Peirce there, thank you again.